Welcome to the third meeting of our series, 50 Years of University of Bremen. Just let's change the world. Welcome to the live stream here at the event and 3 nach 9 Studio of Radio Bremen.
There will be a simultaneous translation.
And before we're going to get started, before I will introduce my panel guests, I will pass the floor to Professor Dr. Bernd Scholz-Reiser, the Rector of University of Bremen.
Well, thank you very much, dear panelists, dear alumni, ladies and gentlemen. The world is at the beginning of a decade in transition, so we cannot remain at a standstill. The climate crisis is endangering our livelihoods and threatening freedom, prosperity and security. If this quote sounds familiar, then you have probably already taken a look at the current coalition agreement recently concluded between the political parties SPD, Alliance 90, the Greens, and FDP. The preamble goes on to say, achieving the Paris climate protection goals is our top priority. We are creating a regulatory framework that clears the way for innovations and measures to bring Germany into the 1.5-degree path. That sounds promising. However, in a recent study by the Berlin University of Applied Sciences, researchers have come to the conclusion, though, through a model calculation, that the measures announced in the coalition agreement will not be sufficient to achieve the climate targets of the Paris Climate Agreement. A study commissioned by the Climate Alliance and conducted by the DAAD Econ Institute, which was published only a few days ago, also fits into this picture. It concludes, and I quote, that Germany under the government of the new coalition, despite considerable progress in some areas, will miss the degree of 1.5-degree target set out in the coalition agreement. This is not presumptive, not likely. It's a sober statement without linguistic softeners. Both studies have received a certain amount of public attention. There is great public interest in the issue of climate protection, one of the greatest global challenges of the 21st century. Both studies have also made us aware of what science can and cannot do in addressing this challenge. Science provides an evidence-based foundation that enables us as a society to understand climate change in all its facets. And it seeks ways in which we can confront climate change, mitigate it, and adapt to its consequences. The University of Bremen, which has been involved in climate and environmental research for decades and now wants to develop into a climate university, has also committed itself to these goals. Our scientists conduct research together in interdisciplinary alliances with excellent university and non-university partners, regionally, nationally, and internationally. The University of Bremen Research Alliance and the Worldwide International Universities Climate Alliance are just two of the many examples I would like to mention here. The scientific focus on marine, polar and climate research at the Center for Marine Environmental Sciences also deals intensively with a wide range of issues that serve to improve our understanding of man-made climate change and its consequences. Research outside the ivory tower and the assumption of social responsibility, these are central aspects that have been anchored in the mission statement of the University of Bremen since it was founded in 1971. Even today, 50 years later, this claim is still relevant. In terms of climate protection, our university therefore wants to set a good example. We're pursuing the goal of making our campus climate neutral. However, science reaches its limits when it comes to establishing the necessary measures it has identified at the level of society as a whole. That is a political task. Dear Antje, dear Ms. Boetius, I hope you will allow me at this point to take up a statement you made in 2019 in relation to a meeting of the Ethics Council on Climate Change and the role of science. Science talks, but nobody listens, is what you said at the time. Making itself heard is something science cannot do on its own. This requires competent reporting that brings scientific findings to the public and facilitates a societal dialogue. The persistent climate change deniers are countered by many committed groups of the population who take climate change and its consequences seriously and are committed to countering it appropriately. These include, in particular, many young people, such as the Fridays for Future movement. I'm pleased that we're able to gather representatives from sciences, journalism, and the Fridays for Future movement on one podium today. Let us continue to promote public discourse in this composition, which is a discourse that we absolutely need, and I'm looking forward to a stimulating and interesting evening with you. Thank you very much.
Well, and we will follow this appeal because we are not going to talk about anything less than changing the climate. So within the next 1.5 hours, this is what we're going to do. But saving the climate, but how? But I would like to welcome our guests. First of all, the director of Alfred Wegener Institute, Helmholtz Center for Polar and Marine Research in Bremerhaven. This is a long title, and I will just call you director of RV. And she's also professor of Geomicrobiology at the University of Bremen, Professor Dr. Antje Boetius. Then we've got Professor Dr. Manfred Fischedick, Scientific Director of the Wuppertal Institute for, and again a long title, of the Wuppertal Institute for Climate, Environment and Energy, professor at the Schumpeter School of Business and Economics at the University of Wuppertal, and also coordinating lead author in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Hello.
Welcome. Frederike Oberheim, she's here. No, she's not here. She's stranded on a third of the line. That is on her way from Amsterdam, where she's studying. Hilversum, then she went back to Amsterdam, and now she has joined us from her home. So she is a co-organizer of Fridays of Future climate protest in Bremen, and she turned into Bremen Woman of the Year in 2020. So welcome to you as well.
Thank you very much.
I would also like to welcome Karsten Schwanke, meteorologist and science journalist, TV presenter and moderator of science magazines, and our ARD weatherman.
Hello.
So welcome. If one had said, well, warm yourself up and keep warm, so many very volatile people. Now we've got 10 degrees here. Is this the weather or is it the climate, Mr. Schwanke?
Yeah, well, it's of course the weather to start with. Weather is what's happening out there right now. Weather is something that is a very emotional thing for us. There's nobody who thinks that weather is bad or wrong. Everybody has an opinion on it. We experience weather, we allow rain to fall on our skin. And all that is weather, and the 10 degrees is weather as well. Even before I started presenting the weather on TV more than 25 years ago, I said we have to separate weather and climate. Scientifically, weather is what we have now, and climate is long-term, 20, 30-year averages that allows us to describe this. But over the last few years, I've noticed more and more. And of course, you can still separate this quite strictly, but there are reasons to do so once in a while. But we have to bring things back together. This climate change is something that won't happen via statistical figures over 20 to 30 years. We will experience it through day-to-day weather, and that's why the question is so important. What about the weather out there is already the influence of climate change today? And we'll have to look for the answers and give the answers to these questions. And then above all, how will the weather change over the next decades in the context of global change? That's not easy to answer, but it's a challenge. I prefer cold weather, yes, and I did make it to some amateur ski competitions, never breaking a leg.
Okay, and hot and cold, this is what we're going to experience, what researchers forecast for us if we do not really reduce CO2 emissions. And the current event, which we all have in our minds, these were the tornadoes of the weekend in the United States. And in particular, Kentucky, there were 30 tornadoes of a really unusual strength. And Frederike Oberheim, what came to your mind when you saw this and heard about it?
Of course, such extreme weather events and the destruction in their wake are exactly what we warn against with our protests again and again. And it's probably one of the most palpable and obvious consequences of climate change, and that's why it's not unexpected. And we will, of course, see more extreme weather events, just like we had it in Germany in the summer, and it will become more and more frequent. And that's why it's so important to take political measures to counteract this now.
Well, we are all asked to participate and join, and we will sort out who can do what and when. And I don't know, Ms. Boetius, whether you saw this excerpt. It was ARD or ZDF. They showed a woman standing in the tornado remainders, and then she was asked whether this has to do with this. She said, "I don't believe in times, I trust in God." So one really would have to convince many people. So what is one telling to these people who are not convinced?
Well, first of all, I try to hear all people and their voices and to get a perspective on where this comes from and how to deal with it. I don't think that science needs to convince each and every one. Plus, there's always the question of religion and people's beliefs. Don't exclude each other. You can be a scientist and a believer. You can believe and be a scientist. So all of this is possible in our minds. And we have to be careful that we shouldn't do what I've come across again and again over the last decades, that we have to bring everybody along, that everybody has to be convinced. I don't believe that we have such clear facts and responsibilities from the point of view of society to help ourselves, to make progress, to help future generations, and to win the future, which needs to be negotiated, of course. We can't hang about until everybody understands and appreciates science.
But then it really becomes difficult, especially if you look at the role of the United States, and this is one of the major players who has to join in and who has to be helping us on this ship, which might be sinking, a nice picture. And then you say, okay, it's climate change, and this is what Biden says in contrast to his predecessor. But then there's also real politics, because he also says we will have to wait in between the elections. So he doesn't dare to do that much. And without these bigger groups, states and countries, one probably won't be able to achieve anything if one wants to make progress.
Well, that's right. Climate change is the global problem, of course, and we can only solve this problem globally with joint forces, and we can't beat about the bush here. The US, China, India, and other large emitters. And if we look at the US, for instance, it's not all standstill. There are many states within the US who do a very positive climate policy and environmental policy. There's a lot of things happening. Innovative forces are being released, investments into renewable energies. So climate protection is one thing, but also some of those technologies are quite lucrative, and the Americans, if they can do one thing, they can calculate, and so they jump on this bandwagon. Of course, things could speed up a bit if the federal government exerted a bit of pressure, and we had 4 years not only of standstill but retraction actually, and now Joe Biden does this. He does in order to protect the climate, but also to get the US fit for technological competition, because there are huge markets in the climate protection field, and the Americans want to participate in this just like the Chinese, so there are strong forces here. But it is, of course, still too slow for the international community, so I wish to see more political forces being released.
Karsten Schwanke, as an expert for media, you told us a lot about the floodings at the Ahr Valley. These terrible pictures, and the Ahr Valley is still destroyed, and many other areas as well, though we might not be looking into that direction anymore that much. But these images, are these images that are moving something, these terrible pictures? Because climate change is still abstract, and once such a catastrophe has occurred, one suddenly understands through these images what has happened, and without being cynical, that this is almost good to have such an event, so that you can say, look, people, this is what is going to be seen more and more if we don't do anything.
I can understand why you're saying that this is nearly cynical, that we need this. We don't need it, of course. But it's true that such disasters promote a change of awareness. It's not by coincidence that it was in 2018 that a young, sweet woman started Fridays for Future. Back then, when you think about what happened in Central and Northern Europe, I learned when I studied that a stable weather pattern in Europe lasts for no more than 6 weeks, and everybody who had a sunny summer, a rainy summer, we knew after 3, 4, 6 weeks it'll change again. The high pressure will go away and the lows will come. And 2018 was different. We had 6 months high pressure running, something unprecedented. We knew that in the course of climate change there would be entire complex shifts of weather patterns in the Northern Hemisphere. And if you'd asked me, well, if we have an increase of 2 to 3 degrees worldwide, this will happen, and we had it at 1 degree. So 1 degree global warming, we had 6 months of stable weather conditions, all records broken in Scandinavia, and Fridays for Future arose. And that shows that such events do have an impact, just like this disaster in the Ahrtal region. I hear a lot that we get a lot of requests and discussions. I get private people calling me privately who lost everything, who ask me, should we rebuild our homes? And that is very touching. Those are questions that I can't calmly answer in good conscience. And I live in North Rhine-Westphalia, in Cologne, and in the Eifel region. There were huge damages as well, and that affects people, and something is happening, so that a lot of questions are being asked.
But the problem is, well, there's research on this, and you can certainly add something from your psychology studies. So people are very much touched by crises. There's a reaction, but this reaction really doesn't last long. And if you see the connection between CO2 and atmosphere and crisis in humanity, and this is something that is researched by scientists, then crisis is putting an impetus, but then this is caught up again. And we do not succeed through a continuation of crisis to change our path, which would be actually our task. And activating people with regard to transformation, that is to really take a completely new path, to rethink the world. Well, this does not only need the terrible one, but you have to really create images of the future, of what you want to achieve, where you want to get at. And this is also a part that I'm only learning now. This is why I'm also doing other things than scientists. So instead of just saying, well, what will hurt us, what will be lost, you always also have to say, okay, if you put these three switches in the right direction, then we will get somewhere where the life will feel better. So it's also important to set positive images instead of only focusing on the rest, because then you just really feel lost.
So if you say something different from research, it means you go to a theater with projects, you cooperate with musicians, you approach people with art and culture in order to sell this, basically?
Well, yeah, beyond my discipline. So I'm not only speaking to the scientists, but also to economists, historians, or psychologists, because you need everybody together to just get an idea how to continue.
There's a huge opportunity now. We have a new federal government, the so-called traffic light coalition, and another few billion have been made available now to promote climate policies, but there's a lot to be done. The rector of the University of Berlin has said it's the Paris Accord is a top priority to get Germany onto the 1.5 degree path. So that means 80% renewable energy by 2030, moving out of coal use by 2030 ideally. And the new climate and energy minister says all of this will not be possible without any hurt. What will this pain be? Because that makes people, that puts the fear of the Lord into people. That's the opposite of what we just heard. It doesn't make people look forward to transformation. When you hear pain, then people think this is going to be difficult and expensive.
Well, I will speak about impositions in a moment, but I will start with the fun, because one part of the coalition contract is also the positive narrative about climate change. So there's not a contrast between climate protection and prospering economy, and they focus on opportunities, that is to design climate protection. So these are very different sounds from what we've heard earlier on a federal level. So I think that this is positive to be taken on. And the preamble, but also the climate-related texts tell us that there's a will to implement something. So not just discussing goals, but really the understanding that we need to do something. We cannot just administer goals and then occasionally touch them, but we really have to do something. So that's positive. And then in detailed descriptions, I completely agree to what we've heard before. If we put everything together, then we are not at 1.5 degrees, but we are at 1.8 to 2 degrees Celsius. That's the path we're taking, so we need to continue and do more. But the principal direction has been taken. And why is that so? Well, it's not the expansion of renewable energies, and I will come to the impositions or unreasonable demands, but it's about building and traffic. So the ambitions that we see are far too low to really get onto a transformation path, and especially in transport and traffic, where nothing really has happened in 30 years. So to create a turnaround and achieve a turnaround, well, there we have to say we are staying on a superficial level, and there you really have to make far more demands. So what we need, so what we've seen over the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen that the increases have, the approvals have decreased. Planning, this is, well, for wind energy, we need 7 to 6 years for the approval for wind farm, and then you just you reach 2030 and have a new wind farm. So we need a much faster acceleration for the approval of these, and there is also maybe sometimes a contradiction between climate protection and nature protection.
But we're still at the point of description. We're still at the Sunday speeches. We still say we need this, that, and the other, but nobody has described how it can be done, how it can be implemented, actually. That has to be described. And I think, I feel like many other people, we feel like, okay, this has to happen, but how?
Well, how, Ms. Grimmer, the planning and approval processes and times have to be changed. We have to become much quicker. And what you can do is you can employ more people who are in charge of these permits and approvals. This can be done. And then you have to ask yourself how to deal with resistance, nature protection, bird protection, and climate protection. And the procedures have to be reduced to 6 months or 1 year, and also the appeals have to be shortened, because the problem that we've got today, as soon as there's a slight change in planning, you restart from zero, and the time then procedure starts again. So this is eating up time. So the measures are set, and there has to be an understanding between nature protection and climate protection, and how to implement this. This is really so important. So this is what has to be achieved.
Yes, right. So that is really very complex, and we'll get back to that later on, because the deeper you dive into this, the more complex everything seems to get. If we take a look at traffic policy, we can take a look at Bremen, where they're talking of a car-free inner city, and I know that Fridays for Future is much more radical. They say we want to have an entirely auto-free city of Bremen. Those are huge demands. Do you really believe, Frederike, that this will happen? Or is that more like wishful thinking?
I don't know whether this will happen, because that depends on politics, but we believe that this is absolutely necessary. So we really need a turnaround from transport, which is not just going from combustion engine to, we need something that goes from individual to collective transport. So we need far more public transport. We need far more bicycle and pedestrian transport. And it's not that no cars are allowed from tomorrow in the city, but we have to build up a structure which allows for a comfortable and cost-efficient and simple way and alternative for the citizens of Bremen.
Okay, just sticking with traffic policy and with a view to signals from the federal government, we have the new transport minister, Volker Wissing, and he says if you buy an electric car, you get a tax reduction. So these are counterproductive things in our discussion, and you said it at Friday for Future, and you underscored it before the elections. Well, people, you know who votes for you, so do your best. And what happens? 23% of young people vote for the FDP, and young people seem to, the message seems to be okay, we're in favor of climate change policies and climate protection, but we won't go along with any restrictions. Did you cry into your bed at night when you heard this election result?
Well, all in all, it was really sad. We had organized a watch party in Amsterdam, and then the result was really very far away from what we had hoped for. For me, the FDP election result, the liberal ones, was really very surprising for me, but on the other hand, it also shows that these old parties, which already said the name, are no longer successful with the younger voters. And if you look at the campaign of the liberal FDP, then this is something that appeals more to youngers than what SPD, Social Democrats or Christian Democrats did. So it's about multimedia, it's about digitization, it's about opportunities and chances. So all this sounds quite good, but still we also need a turnaround, but this is a turnaround for the whole of our society, that is with regard to critical thinking and what it would mean to achieve really the 1.5 degrees and what this would mean for society and also for the transformative spirit that we're talking about.
Yeah, indeed, the other focus of this government and the future that is now starting all of a sudden since we've had this new government is on digitization, but that also means huge increases in power demands because of this. I think I read it somewhere in a serious source. I think it was a quality paper. YouTube uses up as much power as 5 African countries together. So the digital generation will use even more power. So that is actually contradictory. You have to handle this. How can you overcome this? By saying you need a lot of power for digital work, and where is it supposed to come from?
Well, I think we were born into society as it already were at the moment, and for many of us, this was at the beginning of digitization. And I think it's important to focus on political levels. So to say we need renewable energies, and we need an enormous expansion of renewable energies, and not to focus that much on a YouTube video that you might have to do without, or that one should no longer watch, or TikTok and co. And really more focus about the change on political level and with regard to the overall society.
Well, I think we need, I believe, from my point of view, we can't play this off against each other. We need digitization as an important lever in order to tackle the problems that we need to solve in the context of climate change and climate adjustment. So digitization can help us a lot here. When I really think of this as a meteorologist, my scenario would be renewable energies, spreading it across Europe, so where the sun is shining, solar energy is generated, where the wind is blowing, you generate wind power, and then of course you need digital solutions in order to plan this and transport it left, right and center. That would be a great solution. Or the move from individual transport to a complex public transport system that needs a lot of digital solutions. So that is why we need to look at it, because at the end of the day, we will reduce our carbon footprint that way.
And then research is required. Digitization is a key word which really covers different technologies, which all have areas where we talk about efficiency, new software. With the new software, you only need 1/10 of the electricity that you would need otherwise. Then it's about proper use of waste heat to also make sure that this is getting better, so the heat that is generated can be used immediately. So this is done, and there are very large innovation areas where you also then get away from digitization, only eating energies. And Microsoft, for example, is putting a server into the sea because that can then cool better, and there are also buildings which are heated through the computer waste heat. So all these things can be put apart and brought back together again, but a lot of research needs to be done. And at the end of the day, it's also linked to a cost factor. So then it has its own economic sense, because once energy is becoming extremely expensive, and it's already started in that way, then it really makes it worthwhile to invest into this area, and all this helps.
So what will the BAS say on this if there's a huge computer in the sea?
Well, it will withdraw and might really scratch a bit, because there might be some parasites that develop.
So doesn't it heat the sea as well?
Okay. Yes, but you can put really many servers into the sea until this happens.
Well, I'd be very worried about it, but you know better.
Well, and all this can be calculated. And the sea, the ocean, this is our life support system. And it's 70% of the servers by 3.8 kilometers in depth, and it's cold. The sea is cold. And it's an exchange. And this is why why the local heating that is happening for these technologies, this is not something that will change the seas and oceans.
All right, that calms me, but there are so many approaches to solutions, and you only hear about them in this group, and that aren't really publicized. Is that something, Mr. Fischedick, that you hear about as well, that there are many technologies and many companies or researchers are only waiting to launch them, but that it's all not yet mature for market because there's lack of acceptance and political support?
Well, first of all, it's about understanding that there's a field of tension. For example, we need really a circular society, and we also need an efficient transport management, which also needs digitization. And this is a field of tension. The second field of tension is the enormous use of resources. A lot of material are contained in the digital hardware components, and I think that this might be the bigger problem, that is, what are the recycling options? So you have to identify the different fields of tensions and then to look for possible solutions. This is the first major step. And then it really depends on politicians. At the beginning of the year, we collaborated in the environmental digital agenda. That is to identify where can politics really provide standards and provide settings. For example, that certain servers will have a certain electricity in order to increase the efficiencies. And here, politicians can do quite a lot, and then the companies will voluntarily have a role of a precursor, and the awareness has increased significantly, and the precursors then have to get into the role of a multiplayer. So, and then you need political regulation.
You're a consultant to politicians as well, both at the national and international levels. So how receptive are politicians for this? If you learn about this from researchers and you go to Mr. Habeck, for instance, in the near future, and you tell them there's something that could help us, how flexible are people? How much exchange is there between politics and research?
Well, the exchange has become better and more intense, and there's the understanding that we're really in a very complex situation, also for political decision makers and also within the economy. Things are so complex, so dynamic, and there's so many degrees of uncertainty, and the wish of exchanging information has increased. So we now have had a more intense exchange with political decision makers, but also with the economy. And we are not just standing there saying we know it all, and we can only show one or the other possible solution, and the politicians and the politics then have to balance it out, and also thinking about complexities and uncertainties, and then come up with decisions. And we can only provide support, and this is what we're trying to do. And my experience is that this is now understood much better than before, because there's the understanding that under these complex situations, one really has to come up with quick decisions.
I heard you say someday. Did you get the feeling that right now, with the current coalition government, there is actually a sense of movement, that things will accelerate?
I'm quite convinced that one is going to try. I don't know how often permit or approval, how often you can read this word within the coalition contract, 40 to 50 times. So one is really trying to focus on this. I'm a bit skeptical whether they'll succeed. That is, succeeded to the extent of a factor 10, which is required. So I'm a bit skeptical, but I'm certain and quite optimistic that they will give it a try.
Well, that takes us back to what we all know. It's about the major framework conditions. It's about adjusting the big screws, not the tiny little tweaks. And the problem is to get into an economic situation in the conditions that we live in that promote protection of the environment, protection of people, and penalizes the destruction of the environment. That is the first thing that has to change, and this lever is being shift it now, and it has the biggest potential impact, actually. And those are the main findings that we have from history, from observation. When does the CO2 system respond at all? This lever is being shifted. It is being shifted in Europe, and Germany has to be in this. And then, of course, we need to have overall international negotiations, because it's also about systemic modifications that are huge and that will give people hope. And that is why when we get together, when anybody listens to us, it is important always to think about that we need the big, effective things, and we can always talk about the small things and dispute about them, and you go back home and think that the world is bad. But no, it has started changing, because things are such that the generation which has it ahead of themselves needs to build their own future, just like all other generations before them, and it does.
There are 3 points that I would just like to add. It's different than 5 to 10 years ago, because today we know we've got the conceptions as to how transformation could be designed. So 5 to 10 years ago, they didn't exist. And the technologies we need are now competitive, renewable energies. So the starting situation is very different than 10 years ago. Then secondly, a different situation because society is different, because they put pressure and they say that there's a willingness to change. And the third big point is that industry and economy are not on the side of the local, but they try, but they've got investment plans already. Steel industry, they've got their investment plans for getting into a hydrogen-based green steel industry. A chemical industry has also these plans ready. So once the economic framework conditions have been set, then these investments will be started. So this is very, very different than a couple of years ago. And this is why I'm a bit more optimistic to say that we can succeed this turnaround. Whether it's quick enough for the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, I'm a bit more skeptical, but our situation is very different than a couple of years ago.
We'll get into more detail here with all the various industries and what they're planning to do. You looked into this a lot. And I would like to ask Antje Boetius, before we get into that, who has been observing for many years where we need to go and where we're not normally looking, i.e. below the surface of the seas, what's happening there. And I'd like to get Frederike Oberheim involved. This slight optimism that we hear here, this sense of a new departure, is that something that you share? Do you feel that? Do you say, okay, I feel the same? Or is the pessimism factor among Fridays for Future bigger? Does it predominate? That we won't be successful?
Well, I think it depends on my daily mood as to what is prevailing. All in all, I've got the feeling that what we see in the coalition agreement and during the negotiations and also at the beginning of the COP, that we have really won the narrative. So everybody can stand behind it and say, we are in favor of climate protection. And you can see this for all political parties and their campaign spots. It was about renewable energies, and it was always included. And nobody can say, I don't want to have climate protection. No political decision maker. But what we also see is, as soon as you read the small print, that is for the COP, but also for the coalition agreement details that not everybody might read in detail or would want to look at, then we see that the measures are not sufficient for 1.5 degrees goal. And this is why it's important to remain vigilant and also alert. It's also as citizens who are interested in maintaining a future on this planet, that is to be alert, to raise one's voice, to put pressure, because in recent years we've seen that all the changes and all the shifts of narrative would not have happened if there hadn't been any protest.
Well, Antje Boetius, tipping points, we had them before. We heard about 1 degree, as has been mentioned earlier, and the changes that have happened already where something has changed dramatically in the climatic conditions. What about the marine world? Where are there any observations? You've been diving for 30 years very deeply, and you're doing research in the oceans, in the Arctic. What are 3 points that you would like to use to shake politicians up, to paint a drastic picture, telling them, people, if you see that, you'll know that you have to take action?
Well, I do not communicate like this with politicians, but there are 3 main elements of tipping which are very clear, and everybody can experience them. That is one, which might be the next one, which is definitely marine. This is the extinction and the bleaching of coral reefs, and for many years we have been of more than 50% or 70%, and at the end of this century it will be more than 90% or even more. And this is really something, and it's not just the color that is changing, but you can say each third live animal or being alive is living in these reefs and is supported by this, and the changes are then enormous. And it's not just coastal protection against storms and high waves, but it's really the center of being for many human beings, that is local fisheries or tourism or whatever. And this is probably the first fundamental and global tipping moment, because it will have such an effect on other species and also on human beings. The second one, which I noticed, polar research in the Arctic, this is the Arctic ice, 13% of losses in summers with uncertainties in the system, because there is an inert acceleration which could lead, under worst assumptions, that in 10 to 20 years we will be standing there for the first time, and then the sea ice will go below 15%, and this would again mean a mass extinction and dying. And I had been in the year 2012, where we have seen the biggest melting, and then you see everything that is on the ice will just fall down and will drop into the deep sea, and this is where we'll find them. And there are huge areas where this is taking place, and the further tipping moment is really the disappearance of glaciers on land. And this is again something where you have glaciers in so many areas, like the mountains, where they are responsible for so much. That is for water on the fields, local weather situations, but also for the way of making sure that there's a multitude of insects and flowers and plants. And glaciers and the mountains, well, in Europe, this will be very quick. And Iceland have already started to say goodbye to those. So the loss of global landscapes, this is really something that is very detrimental. And all these are individual elements which will then accelerate other elements that will follow. So I could enumerate the others, but then our whole emission would be over. And it's not really of interest of enumerating everything that needs to be fought for. Our interest really should be to tell us what are the solutions we've got.
Yes, but the polar bear losing its habitat, that's something that people can understand. Ms. Oberheim, you wanted to become a marine biologist, but then you didn't.
Why not about marine psychologists? That would be a solution.
So maybe we'll invent this profession.
This has been my dream, childhood dream. I've been an activist. I really loved the rubber boats, and then I was really dreaming of marine biologists. But then I understood that this is not everything that one is doing, getting out on a rubber boat.
But the warming of the Arctic, that takes us back to the weather. Of course, there's a dramatic connection in this entire context. I think the word jet stream is something that everybody learned about this year. because we know that it kind of freezes weather patterns in a position, and then it can be hot for a long period of time. The heat dome in Canada with very high temperatures, 50 degrees plus, and wood fires, etc. So there's a lot to talk about between the two of you, I think.
We see the tipping elements in the ocean, and also still in the world of the ice. We also see it in atmosphere. And the jet stream that you mentioned, well, there's still a lot of basic research that needs to be done. But what we can say quite certainly is that if we look at summer months in particular, so the summer half year on the northern hemisphere, then we already see it now, and we have to assume that the above proportionally heating of the Antarctic means that this strong wind band at this height, the jet stream, will weaken, because there is a major temperature difference between tropics and Antarctic. And if Antarctic is then heating more quickly, then the wind speed will reduce, then the engine stops. And what happens if I allow a river from Helmholtz to get into the valley? Then the flow speed will reduce, and then it will start to meander. And this is exactly what we see in northern hemisphere. Jet stream is getting weaker, it starts to meander, and then it creates waves which are moving less quickly from west to east. They can stand, or sometimes they even might move retrograde, that is taking the opposite direction. And this has as a consequence that certain weather situations will reinforce themselves and can be maintained and will move even more rarely. And this summer there was a very interesting study by British scientists who researched how the number and intensity of slowly moving lows in summer could move. The R Valley had been really developed by this depression or low pressure area, and this can increase by a factor of 14 until the end of this century. And this is research, and only if it's factor 10 or 12, it's so much, it's such an enormous increase of individual events. And at the same time, one has to mention that for us, in summer, we will have less precipitation. That is, we have a stronger concentration. So we will have really droughts, and on the other hand, we will have then strong rains. And I can take the map of Germany, and we don't have just one region of medium-range mountains, which are not prepared for these enormous pressures. And then we will probably see more pictures like we've seen them in the Sauerland, Eifel and Ahr Valley.
Yes, and the more CO2 we emit, the worse it gets. That's why we try to reduce CO2 emissions. That's why we try to reduce the use of fossil fuels. Thanks a lot. Hydrogen is available. Mr. Fischedick, it will save us, will it?
Well, hydrogen is one component, one strategy among others, and there's not one major instrument. We really need a complete set of different instruments, and it starts with simple things like energy efficiency. And I looked in the coalition contract. How often do you read energy efficiency in the contract? 0 times. Yeah, this is really little. However, the potentials are still there, and this is something that one could quickly tap in. And climate change is finally impacted by what is emitted in the sun. And if one quickly can reduce something, then one really should do it. And this is why energy efficiency is really important. And renewable energies we mentioned, and in Germany there's wind and solar and a bit of biomass, little water and little hydro power, and this is why wind and solar is required, and then there are also the fluctuation that we are going to see. And then indeed, the next big step will be stronger electrification, direct electrification, that is electric cars, for example, also for buildings, that is electric heat pumps, because that is most efficient, that is without losses. It can directly be produced, and the next step would be hydrogen or derived from hydrogen synthetic fuels for industry. And there's a golden rule: the closer you stay to the original, the lower the losses and the bigger the effect. So direct approach from renewable energies, then hydrogen, then synthetic fuels. And this is probably the big questions that you ask: where will it come from, hydrogen, and what is the color of hydrogen? And there we know from the 4 or 5 transformation studies that have been published, partly will be produced locally, and a larger part will have to be imported. That is the potential in our densely populated country are not sufficient. And then we look what are the best partnerships that we could enter into in order to create hydrogen infrastructures. And the question is, how quickly could this be done?
At the University of Bremen, there's a lot of research being done here in the field of production technology, efficient energy services is what it's called. Hydrogen is really at the focus, and there is a lot of awareness in at the law school as well. For instance, the cultural sciences are looking at it. And let's stick to production technology with hydrogen research. Tom Stürmann, who is leading here, he says the extension targets in the coalition agreement should have been triggered 15 years ago. And you say that for 30 years we've been wanting a climate policy concept, but of course you can't do it yourself.
Well, because the climate really doesn't make a difference whether you resign or not. This doesn't play a role. And I think it's important to come back to the situation that it's not Germany alone with its own surfaces and possibilities needs to organize it. No, not at all. And this is also something with regard to the coalition agreement, where I ask myself, is it really good to say 1.5 degrees for one country, one nation? Does that make sense? I think this is questionable. And of course, one needs to get started. And nowadays, only nations can really provide laws for their countries and for their own economy. It might be easiest to adapt. But in order to make progress, to become quick, it's really terrible if everybody tries to do his or her own thing. And this is why I think Europe is important.
Yeah, but that takes us back to Glasgow, to COP26, the last climate change. Antje Boetius, you were there actually, and the international discussions are held there, and we know without China, without India, it won't work. China is building coal-fired power stations, India as well. Canada has just opened, Australia has just opened up the largest coal mine and gas field, so that seems to go into the wrong direction. What was the mood that you picked up in Glasgow? I think you went there during the last few days and had a lot of talks. You looked a little bit behind the scenes and had talks with people. What was your perception of what Glasgow actually achieved? Well, it's one of the big international conferences. This whole series is an act of getting together globally of the one humankind that only has one planet. And those are negotiation moments that are needed, of course, because how will we get a global act otherwise? as I said, that will change the economic framework conditions that condition our activities. That's only achievable globally, and the conference cannot set law, cannot legislate, as you said yourself, but it is an impulse for negotiation that is actually quite impressive. And it's not like this will be done without China or India. Those were targets that actually for the first time moved the global climate tracker into this big gap that we have to the 1.5 degree path. The wording that we are actually targeting it is very essential already. It is about the pure human right to existence, the right of entire people, of entire ethnicities to live. For instance, 200 million will lose their entire existence, their island, and that is what's being negotiated there. It is a political negotiation. It's very bureaucratic in many parts. There's bickering about individual formulations, and I know that people don't understand it necessarily, but language is important, and it is absolutely a difference whether you accept that a target is worded in such or such a way, and whether it encompasses all of the nations and excludes some of them. So I thought that was very positive, because the attempt was to deal with respect of the existence of everyone.
Svenja Schulte, the minister from the SPD, said historically, and Fridays for Future said blah, blah, blah. So, Frederike Oberheim, how did you feel about it? You weren't that enthusiastic about the talks at Glasgow.
Not really, unfortunately. That's exactly what I mentioned earlier. We gained the narrative, and everybody's getting into gear to end the climate crisis, but we don't see the adjustment screws that need to be tweaked. Even with the final paper, there's a lot of things missing in terms of climate justice, compensation for the climate damage that has been caused, particularly by the North, the global North, at the expense of the global South. And I believe that here we need more responsibility among the nations. We need budgets, CO2 budgets, historic relations that need to be included, the polluter pays principle, and that is something that is still missing in politics oftentimes.
Karsten Schwanke, I interrupted you.
I wanted to get back. This China bashing is always an easy thing to do. We could also say that China is the country that has built more solar power stations than any other country. I would love to see the development speed of China in terms of high-speed trains, etc. I'd like to see that in Europe. It's easier, of course. It's always easier to point the finger at somebody. We have to move away from this. I think that China will bypass us left, right, and center when they realize that they can sell these technologies the world over. And we should take a closer look at what's happening there, particularly how they manage to maintain that high speed. Of course, it's a different system, and I don't want to live in such a system, but we have to take a look at what are the positives that we can learn from China. It's not like China is only copying the rest of the world. I think that's an important point as well. And I'll bash the media a bit now, even though I work in the same field. During the climate negotiations in Glasgow, I was often asked by colleagues, what do you expect of Glasgow? And I said, well, that's international negotiations, that's an interesting field, but that doesn't really affect me. We're in the middle of coalition negotiations. We have to take a look at Germany. We have a lot of homework that we need to do. And then the talk shows kept asking, what does climate change cost us, or climate policies? And I said, that's the wrong question to ask. How much is climate change going to cost us? 30 billion every year, like in the R region? I don't want that. that. So any euro that we invest into climate protection today contributes to the improvement of our living conditions, and at the end of the day, 100 years from now, will have been much better invested and cheaper than anything that we can later put into repairing disaster damage.
Manfred Fischedick, we have already discussed it. You said industry is willing to change, and there's so many news about this, and Alfred has said that they're going to produce sustainably. Do they want or do they have to do, or is it not important what it is?
Well, no matter why, the important thing is they do. They want and they have to, but I would like to get back to COP. For international negotiations, you have the consensus principle. That's why they're so slow. If you have nearly 200 states sitting there that try to adopt something in consensus, then they wind up discussing for 8 hours on a single word, maybe exaggerating a bit. But of course, at the end of the day, you have something watered down, of course. For instance, the wording concerning fossil phasing out of coal, so that was watered down at the last minute. That's the price of consensus that you have to pay. Nevertheless, these negotiations are incredibly important because at the end of the day, we do get something out of it. What's even more important with Glasgow is what happened outside of the formal conference. These many bilateral negotiations where 80 countries said we want to get out of methane production earlier, and 30 countries said by 2030 no more investment into coal and gas infrastructure, and many countries, including the automotive industry, said we want to move away from combustion engines earlier.
Maybe we could quickly come to the financial industry and what role it plays.
Well, there's a lot of attempts there, and I've seen it at the UN, where you have scientists, civil society representatives at a table, and then the question is, what can every individual company do to set the agenda rather than waiting for national individual negotiations? And of course, insurance companies, financing play a big role. If you calculate how much it costs, you'll find big adjustment screws everywhere in the cities, everywhere. And if banks give no credit anymore, or there's no insurance available anymore for certain things, by certain criteria, for instance, does coal play a role here or not, then the market will change much faster than you could ever organize it otherwise. And that simply happened because it's a hub where you can meet and where things change because you're so exposed and you have all these different contexts. I have to say I've become a bit sensitive. Such a conference that has to haggle about the words because it's about the language that we normally have in negotiating human rights. To call that blah blah, I think, is disrespectful because it is disrespectful of the language that binds us as people together. And we can't say we have to do this, that, and the other in order to implement things. A conference won't do that. We have to separate this. What's important is to use the knowledge that we have and to use the language that helps us to build the future. But to get into a mode where everything is talked down and destroyed, that's not helpful to anyone. So I'm very happy that these conferences happen. And of course, the targets could have been stiffer, the phase out of coal and fossil fuels, etc. But compared to anything that came before, there was never such a leap in the targets and the promises that now, of course, reality has to catch up with.
1.5 degrees dead, life to climate policy, is that what we could say?
Not at all. You can't say that because 1.5 degree has a history as a term that has to do with the fact that we need to grant people on the island nations a place in this world. If you wash this away, then basically you imply that the people who are at the top, who have the money, have a right to exist and the others don't. That is inhumane, and that is why we as scientists can't say, okay, we failed to achieve 1.5 degrees, so what? No, it's about the right to existence, to acknowledge the right to existence of people.
That was just the title of NZZ magazine. Okay, and Frederike, as it's more difficult for you to join the discussion from Amsterdam, so I would like to give you the floor. So with regard to the assessment of what happened at Glasgow, would you like to add something? If not, we would continue.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's very important that these meetings should happen. And I don't think that the UN stops organizing climate summits, because I don't think that it'll take us any closer to a solution or a climate justice. What we really want to achieve is that we see that we don't get any closer to implementation of policies. We get more promises that we can find at all levels of politics, be it at the UN or the German coalition government or the climate emergency in Bremen. But we can see that the measures that are taken are not appropriate. Just proclaiming a crisis that everybody is willing to do now, that's not enough, and I think that's where we have to act now, and where we have to make it real hard on politicians to hide behind their big promises, just continuing supporting fossil fuels with their policies.
Okay, then we leave it at that, and then I would like to come to industry. So steel might be the most important point. I think 6% of CO2 emissions in Germany are generated by the steel industry. So how could steel become green? I cannot even imagine that. This is a dirty business if you look at the figures, but apparently there are ways and opportunities.
They're available, and not only in steel, but in many other industries as well. And this is why more than 1,000 big corporations were represented in Glasgow as well. Why? Because they know that they won't be able to make money with their traditional ways of producing anymore, and that is why industry is now considering of how they can make steel green, for instance. What we've had is the blast furnace-based steel production. There are many steel mills in the rural area in Germany, and what will be done in the future, and can be done, is to use hydrogen for steel production. So you can reduce iron with steel with hydrogen, to produce steel, and that can be done. There is an interim step that could be done with mineral gas that is useful in order to test the production facilities. So it's no witchcraft. What's interesting is that 5 years ago, we spoke about these technologies with big steel manufacturers in Germany, and they nearly drove us off the yard. Not possible, too expensive, what do you want there? And now all German, all European, and nearly all international steel manufacturers have plans at the ready who say as soon as the competitive environment is appropriate, we're ready to make the investments, and the financial industry will exert pressure if that's not happening. And we have the European framework, the so-called European taxonomy. It's a terrible term, but it makes a distinction between sustainable and non-sustainable investments. And if you have non-sustainable investment, you get inferior credit conditions and some bashing, etc. So there's so much afoot here that really drives industry in the right direction now.
Well, you are able to assess this, you are close, but what is the risk of greenwashing? That is, companies are just presenting themselves as green to say we are part of it and we don't want to be reproached of not moving, but without doing it really in a convicted and convinced way. So what do you think?
I'm very convinced that they can survive long term, but of course there's there's always a black sheep in industry, no doubt, who claim a lot of things that aren't even true, or who think that their production is CO2 neutral, but 90% of their emissions are compensated for by compensation measures that are oftentimes not transparent enough, that are a bit slippery. So that happens as well. But those are the black sheep, and we need to expose them, of course. But there are many who really have established their own CO2 neutrality targets that are quite transparent, how they're going to do it, over which time frame they want to do it. And those are the pioneers, of course, and they need to be supported.
You also mentioned buildings, and construction sector is also a huge area, and we've now got a new ministry for construction. 400,000 new flats and apartments are to be built per year, and this will obviously seal surfaces. And Karsten Schwanke, what are you going to do with all these sealed surfaces?
Construction is a big issue, and that is why I think it's important that we have a construction ministry again. Construction has different aspects. The cement industry, to start with. Cement production creates CO2. It's one of the biggest CO2 emitters worldwide. Cement production worldwide is responsible for more emissions than Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK together. So we can do research. There are opportunities of reducing the CO2 production in the CO2 generation in the context of cement production. There are many options, building with wood, etc. And of course, we would have to move away for construction to build less laterally so that we have shorter pathways. We have to travel less. Now, Corona pushed us in a different direction. People noticed home office is possible as well, and then I can live in the countryside, and that means that, of course, more surfaces are sealed, and of course, living is becoming more expensive, property is getting more expensive, but there are other aspects, for instance, that every roof should have solar panels. I would sign up to that immediately. Any flat roof should have a green top, because you can have 30, 40 centimeters of soil on top of such a roof, and then, of course, that buffers rainfall. It takes a bit longer for the water to seep through and then go into the sewage system. And, of course, it's important to have green plants in the cities. In a hot day, the temperature in a park in a city can be up to 10 degrees lower than 2 meters beside it.
Well, those who live in Bremen, if you go through the Bürgerpark in summer, you know that this is actually the case.
But you have to keep the park green. That's the next challenge. This cooling effect works only if we have green trees. If, like in 2018, 2019, we allow them to dry off so that they have yellow leaves in September, then you don't have this cooling effect anymore. So the cities have to think about, how can I create cisterns or water reservoirs below ground or above ground in order to collect the water so that it's available in the hot summer for the plants.
Well, this is quite a radical change of cities, if I hear what you're suggesting. That is these ideas.
It hasn't to be done in a single year, but you have to consider it. And piece by piece, whenever you have a building measure, instead of a park, underground car park, build a cistern. Of course, that costs money, it takes time, but we have to finally get cracking.
Frederike Oberheim is in favor. I see you nodding. Is there anything else else that you would like to add, or was that a wrong interpretation on my side?
No, I fully second this, particularly the fact that it doesn't all have to happen within a year, but nevertheless, we need more radical measures and a more radical utopia of what this future might look like, how we could live in a climate-neutral or climate-appropriate way. And it would also take us a little bit of our crisis feeling when we think about these things. Now, if we look at people who consider that humanity might become extinct, well, and if they ask us to switch off the lights for an hour to get a feel for what it would be like, then that doesn't really feel like a major thing to me. It's a small thing. We really have to drive it home to people that we have a major crisis on our hands and we need major solutions.
Well, today we contribute to finding solutions, and we had a lot of ideas, but we haven't spoken about e-mobility, and this is also a major part. And Frederike Oberheim, the cars will not completely disappear, not even within 10 years. E-mobility, who's got an electric car or hybrid?
I wouldn't buy a hybrid. That is false. That's a lie. They use more power on the short distances. We can see what influence financial incentives have that politicians come up with. For a company car, if you lease it, you have to pay a certain share of tax, which is reduced from 1% to 0.5% for a hybrid car. So if I were a manager of a company and I reduce and I buy a hybrid car, I save money personally, so I'll do that. And when they're returned after the lease, their recharger hasn't been unpacked. So if they really were to use their power after 50 kilometers, when they've used up the battery power, they continue with a piston engine and they use a lot more energy then. So we get the wrong results if we give the wrong incentives.
Well, apparently this is how human beings are working. And in Bremen, I hope I didn't get it wrong, but we have really 300 stations for charging electric cars. Well, you see them more, you don't hear more cars, and this is actually quite pleasant. If suddenly there's a big car next to you and you haven't even heard it, and usually one is also using one's ear when moving in traffic. But again, I think the electricity needs to be produced. And what about the batteries? And there again, we are talking also about rare earth and also mining rare earth in a submarine level. And again, I would like to ask you, Ms. Boetius, so how can one really mine these resources in sea?
Yes, we have a huge footprint as humanity with a view to the periodic system and the need for rare earths, and it's all connected, and ideas of how we could recycle are part of the fact that we're not doing well enough on considering what resources does the planet offer and how can we handle them. The best thing would be to use as few resources as possible, because there'll always be the time where the planet cannot support something and reaches its limits, and with these metals and rare earths that are used in many things are limited, and we need research. Many metals are used at a molecular level, and then they can't be recycled. And if they go to scrap, and if recycled steel is used, for instance, then so many more rare metals are used as a part of the steel where it's used in construction or wherever. So that's only a symbol of a way of an attitude vis-à-vis the use of resources that we can't afford anymore. And I wouldn't like to putting it as problems or increasing complexity, but I think it's just one way of looking at the fact that resources are limited, and we need to take that into consideration and implement this.
I think for all of us sitting here, this is obvious, but many people and many governments striving for prosperity and many governments promising their citizens prosperity, whether they have to or want to do so, then it becomes really more difficult. And then if you just preach that renunciation is important, then this is difficult. You don't really win elections for this.
Well, it's not like this. Basically, what you're implying is that the present minus something as we have today. So you don't think about what's in my iPhone or in this toy that I'm buying, but that's our tradition of thinking. Resources seem to be unlimited, but there are many other human knowledge communities or traditions that really think about every single resource, and they see it as an eternal cycle.
But again, something is changing, especially if we think about the scarcity of drinking water, and that was really scary this summer, that even for us, and we're so used to just consume water, that it would be really urgently important to have a more conscientious way of handling with this important resource.
I'd like to get back to e-mobility. I think the worst thing is to replace combustion engines one-to-one by electric motors. That's what we see now. The cars are becoming greener, but become bigger, more highly performant. So at the end of the day, we don't gain a lot. So they have a huge resource footprint. Recycling, okay, something is happening there, but you're still back in this hamster wheel that you're always chasing your ecological problems. And that is by the replacement, one-to-one replacement. And it makes more sense to think about not to take your tank out to get your rolls, but to simply get on the bike and use that. And as you said at the beginning, cycling, walking, or public transport, using public transport, that's where it starts to make these alternative forms of transport more attractive and to take the cars out of the city center and to show many people, oh, it's not any type of renunciation, it's more green space in the city. I don't have these tins standing around all over the place. So it's not really renunciation, it's a change. It's just about considering how can we conceive, how can we imagine mobility differently in the city. We never even tapped into the depth of what is possible here, and I think that is where we need to take future action. But we're still in these routines that are very hard to transcend.
And we have to start with communication. I was in Thuringia recently, and a colleague from Thuringia Allgemeine Zeitung said, how do you explain this renunciation to people? And then this ICE track that Munich is passing from Munich and is stopping at Erfurt. And then ask people who had to go from Munich to Berlin and whether they had to take the car, whether for them it's renunciation if in 1.5 hours they are now from Erfurt in Munich. Whether they slept or had a coffee, this is not renunciation, this is a gain in quality of life. And each friend of cars even would subscribe to this. Nobody likes to stand in traffic jams.
Well, maybe we can talk about the role of universities and the knowledge system. Because we're part, we say, okay, there are so many pioneers who think about these things. Why don't we start with ourselves? We can see where the possibilities are to make progress. I really find it interesting that the knowledge system is publicly financed. Universities need to be financed. The buildings change. They have infrastructure of research as well. And we all ask, we're a climate university. We want to be climate neutral faster than anyone else. And then we look at the funding in the reality we're caught in today. If you rebuild your infrastructure, which takes a long time as well, then what you build today should meet these requirements. It would be 30 to 100% more expensive. That's absurd, and sometimes the law actually prohibits building universities in that way. So that's a reality, but that's the infrastructure that's supposed to last for the next 40 years. And so you can see how weird we act as people, that we always live in the past, now in the present, when we are trying to build the future. And that keeps me wondering. And the example that we set in Europe, it's 80% of all infrastructure measures that are publicly financed. Then we know where something has to happen, where governments, where the states can decide how to spend the money. That's where they have to lead. But this strange thing that happens now, that science is supposed to take the pioneering role, but is supposed to take the money from the science fund, then that means 30% less research. We do that, okay, buying energy at a higher price if it's green and get better materials than we used in the past, but that's unaffordable, and then that means that we have to compromise on research, and then society has a little bit of a shop window case, but a lack of knowledge gain. So that is absurd, and I hope that the new government understands what the real adjustment screws are.
Well, that is an important appeal. There were a lot of interesting aspects and impetus. I would like to close the round with a small question to each and every one of you. Christmas is ahead of us. What are the climate sins that you are definitely not going to do with regard to eating, travel, presents? Mr. Schwanke.
Well, I was afraid I have to predict the Christmas weather.
Too warm, too humid.
Well, I'm a normal person with all the mistakes and weaknesses everybody else has. I could say now our daughter is 18 and she's a vegetarian, and so we'll have a vegetarian Christmas dinner. Wow, I'm a climate protector. No, it's coincidence. But nevertheless, it'll be very nice. And Otto Lengi, I can only recommend. There's a great vegetarian cookbook.
I think we can make a bit of advertisement for him. He's a great chef. And Frederike Oberheim, are you very consciously approaching lots of eating and decoration for Christmas and things like that?
I would think so, yes. I haven't contributed that much to it. So most things were purchased when I was in kindergarten. So that's sustainable, and I think there'll be a lasagna, and it's very tasty, just like every year. And always a happy Christmas.
And genuine candles and no electric candles.
Right, yes. Well, our Christmas dinner will certainly be something regional, but I'm not a perfect climate protector, so at Christmas maybe I'll do some things that aren't perfect, and they'll be there as well.
What we learned, it's about really major, important questions. What about you, Ms. Boetius?
Well, I have this great tradition of decorating a sailor's Christmas tree, because my grandfather was a captain at sea, and he had a small holder that gets a little bit of spruce decoration, usually the cutoff from other spruces, and you can kind of decorate it in such a way that it looks a little bit like an actual fir tree, and it's of course genuine wood, of course, and my mother hates it because she's always afraid that we might set the house on fire. And then we have these decorations that are more than 200 years old, I think. So it couldn't be more sustainable, because it's only heirloom and rests that we're using.
So I think Ms. Boetius is winning the prize here.
But I'll compensate by having fondue bourguignon with my mother, and people who know France know what it is. It's beef dipped in lard.
Well, this is mouth-watering, and Marcel Reicharnitzky said, well, we feel concerned and our questions are still open, but I must say that I see a lot of energy, knowledge, courage, ideas and activism to solve questions which are still open, and thus we just will put a digital point to the end of this discussion. Thanks to all of us who, before the screen behind, really helped and made this event possible, who discussed it. Antje Boetius, Manfred Fischedick, Frederike Oberheim, and Karsten Schwanke. I would like to thank you. Thanks to the University of Bremen and the Association of Alumni of the University of Bremen for organizing and implementing this, and also Mr. Sodemann in particular, who presented this. And next time we are going to talk about the foundation history of the Reform University, how everything started in 1971. And this is what we're going to discuss on the 20th of January. Thank you very much for your attention, and goodbye, and see you again next time.